It's obvious the political process at the local level here in Shasta County is corrupt. What can we do to fix that?
Maximizing individual liberty, defending inalienable rights, protecting the Constitution. Welcome to the Liberty Enforcement Podcast.
So the first part of answering that question probably deals with the fact that we're really identifying the problem. And the problem we're facing is not so much corruption as much as really bad decision making that's driven heavily by people's pet projects rather than citizen needs. Because what we have is we have three distinct entities in our political process. We have the citizens, we have our elected representatives, and then we have the people who are hired to do the actual tasks. Mm-hmm. So the elected representatives are supposed to oversee the staff and by representing the will of the people. So the question becomes, who sets the agenda for what government should be doing? And right now we have our elected representatives, because there is no real oversight over them, because people are not showing up to the meetings, they're not really engaged in the political process. Our representatives, who are not meant to be leaders, they're meant to be representatives in a Republican form of government, the constitutional republic that we are, they're supposed to be representatives, not leaders. And what they're doing right now is, because there is no pressure on them, they are essentially creating their own agenda based on their own pet projects, ideologies, and so on. So once we identified the problem, that the issue is that who sets the agenda, the answer becomes really simple. The people have to start driving the agenda, and the way that we start driving the agenda is by actually engaging our elected representatives at the meetings, by email, by phone, and driving them towards solving the problems that we see as the real problems in our counties, in our cities, in our school districts, rather than whatever they imagine the problems to be. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah. Can you explain how local government works on the city and county level, the different entities such as county, cities, school boards, transit districts, etc.?
Yeah, so essentially, when we think about government, we tend to think of government as a monolithic single entity, and it's anything but. What you have, especially on the local, and it's the same thing up all the way up to the federal level, from the local to the federal, but we're looking particularly at the local level, is you have all of these different entities with their own different funding mechanisms. And so each entity can be thought of as a little bubble. So for example, you have the county, which is a bubble with its own budget. You have the school district, and we have like 5 of them here in Reading, I believe, that each one of those is a little bubble. You have the cities like Reading, Shasta Lake, some of these other cities that are in the region. Each one of those entities is a separate bubble of its own, having its own ways of generating revenue and having its own oversight board of some sort, such as a city council or a board of supervisors or a school board. And then it has the employees that are hired by each of these bubbles to do the actual jobs. So the way that the roles work is, I think it's really critical to understand the different roles, which is you have the taxpayers who are supposed to be the ultimate oversight. We're the ones who are supposed to be making the decisions as to what we want. Then you have the representatives who are supposed to carry out the will of the people by managing the staff. And the staff are there to serve the public through the representatives, if that makes sense. So you have these 3 different entities. And the reason I say there are 3 different entities is because each one of the entities has its own agenda, its own interests, its own goals, its own paychecks. The staff have a very different interest in carrying out their duties than a city councilman or a board representative, essentially. Like, those are 2 very different positions with very different philosophical reasons for why people take those positions and what they want out of that position and what they have to do in order to keep their job. Because the staff are very much isolated from the political process in many ways, but the political representatives are there to represent the people, and they are the political side of it. So there's all these different interests, different agendas, and the staff really care about their pensions, they care about their paychecks, and hopefully they care about doing a good job, but they really know that they generally cannot be fired. So they have a certain amount of job security, whereas the political representatives know that in order for them to stay in office, they have to actually carry out the will of the people. And the issue there becomes that if the people are not engaged in showing up and putting pressure on our political representatives, they start doing their own thing, which is exactly what we're seeing here on this level.
Pretty much the agenda of the government officials are prevailing over the interests of the people because we're not getting involved. And a lot of people don't even understand that they can get involved and make a difference.
That's right. That's exactly right. And and I want to throw a question at you. I mean, you showed up at the last Board of Supervisors meetings. What was that experience like for you? Because was that your first time coming to the board or speaking at the board?
It was first time speaking.
What was that like?
Yeah, it very much a learning experience. What I did learn, actually, it was coming more than once. Actually, is how I started to get a feel for how it operated, and started to understand what my voice is individually to bring to the table. And then finally, after coming about four times in a row, I was like, I've got something to say. So I got up there and felt like I'm a lot more equipped to make a difference.
And all you did is basically ask questions, right? That's what you did when you got up there. You were asking them questions about the money, essentially. I mean, like, is that?
I didn't get to where I'm asking questions yet. It was the public comment.
Okay.
But that's the next step in this process. I feel like I'm starting to understand I need to get more involved and start asking questions and get some feedback on what is going on in this process.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Can you explain the distinct roles of the elected officials, the hired staff, and the citizens?
Yeah, so as I was saying earlier, the elected officials are there to represent the will of the people. They are not leaders, they're representatives. And then they hire the staff who carry out the day-to-day tasks. So essentially, the good way to look at this is a funnel. You have the public, which has the broadest agenda. You have the representatives, which kind of narrow the agendas and say, okay, what's the top priority? What do we need to do? And then you have the staff, which then act based on that prioritization. And so you have three different groups here, which have very different ways, very different agendas of their own and reasons for being there. And it's really important to get alignment. And what we're lacking right now is we're lacking alignment. We have a total disconnect between what the people need and want and what the staff actually carry out. And what we need to create dialogue so that the citizens are starting to talk to the political representatives, so the political representatives can have a much clearer idea of what the public wants day to day. This can be very specific, like issues down on something that's happening on your street, like a light pole or something, like very, very specific things that are challenge or crime or whatever those things may be, that need to start getting brought to the representatives so they can start getting addressed by the staff instead of the representative deciding that they have their own agenda.
Mm-hmm. And the staffs have an agenda too that sometimes get pushed in the board meetings of like where the money is going. I remember, I think you had mentioned a lot of these agendas are originating from staff that the agencies, and the staff in those agencies are coming up with the agendas on how the money is spent, and the Board of Supervisors are typically rubber stamping these agendas and passing legislation or bills on where this money is going. And it's like a lot of money a lot of times. And yeah.
Right. So what's happening right now is that before every meeting, we have an agenda that's published, what was going to be discussed at that meeting. That's part of the Brown Act, and that's a legally required structure that we have in place throughout California. And so the issue here is that the staff are the ones writing the agendas. They're the ones who are writing the orders. They're the
Which
ones,
staff?
It's the executive staff of the county. It's the county CEO so it's the county CEO and the chair of the board that get to dictate what is on the agenda for any given meeting, essentially. And the county CEO can place whatever they want, which really means that the county CEO and their staff write the actual laws that are then passed by the board.
Who is the county CEO of Shasta County?
His name is Matt Pontes,
Okay.
and he serves at the desire and the will of the board. The board hires and fires him. And the issue, though, is that it's like you have the staff who are basically driving the agenda of the entire county instead of the people. We don't get to control the agendas. We don't get to have any say in what gets discussed at the meeting. We don't get to write the ordinances that are passed by these different boards. It's the staff that write them. So essentially, it's all being driven top down by staff whose primary interest is ultimately their job security and their how much they earn and their pensions. And so if you don't have engagement from the taxpayers, you have the staff basically dictating their own raises, for example. And that has to change. Like, this whole structure has to change. And the way we change is by getting people to show up and have direct say in the whole process at the meetings where these things are get voted on, because a lot of times it's just a rubber stamp. Staff write up a policy, the board then simply rubber stamps it without any much of a discussion of any kind. And we need public there to actually start asking basic questions. It's like, okay, how are you spending this money? Is this the best use of the spending of the money? Is this the priority that we actually care about? And a lot of times it's not the priority. The priority, like, these different groups have very different priorities in terms of what should be getting done. And it's just a question of, like, okay, do we want to be spending 10, 20, $30 million here, $30 million there, without seeing any actual benefit to the taxpayers?
And the people have a lot more sway than they might realize. And you could give an example of that when you were in Berkeley and you saw a minority group showing up to the board meetings and having being able to influence policy on large budget items. So can you go a little bit
Yeah,
deeper into
I mean,
that?
I've been watching politics for a long time. I've run for public office. And essentially, the issue that most people do not understand about our political process is that whoever shows up gets to influence policy. And right now, the people who are showing up are the board and the staff. The taxpayers are mostly absent. So when you have any small group of people who start showing up regularly to the board meetings and asking questions, they basically start dictating the whole dialogue. And they're the one.
That's big.
That's really big, and that's really
Yeah.
powerful. And I think most people don't understand that because they're not really thinking in terms of, we think about this as this big thing, our government. Like, we talk about this thing as a big thing, and it's like, yeah, it's a big thing. It's a very, very big thing. And it's the way you eat an elephant is one bite at a time. And so you have to break it down to small pieces. And the smallest level, you start, whoever shows up gets to dictate the dialogue, because if you start asking questions of the supervisors, at a certain point, they don't want to look stupid. So if you start asking very basic questions that make clear that the policy that they're about to pass doesn't make sense, they're going to snowball it to the next meeting, or they're going to drive real change. And I've seen that play out.
You said that elected officials aren't supposed to lead, but rather represent the taxpayers in a constitutional republic.
Yeah, I think that's a really critical point, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding in terms of this comes back to looking at the government as this big monolithic entity, and it's like you have these people who are supposed to be leaders, and it's like, no, we're in a constitutional republic. The role of our government is to represent the will of the people. Like, we of course want them to be creative. We of course want them to be putting their energy and all of their intellect. But at a certain point, they're not the ones who are supposed to be setting the agenda for our government policy. It's the people that have to decide what is the most important way we can spend millions of dollars. And for example, let's talk about the homeless issue. I think that's a really good example. It's like, do we as a community think it's a good idea for us to spend $100 million, let's say we're going to spend $100 million on homeless to solve the homeless crisis. Is it our best priority to give people services, mental health service or whatever else, without providing them housing, which is what we're doing right now? Or should the priority be to spend that money to house the people who are homeless and actually solve the core issue? And right now, because the staff have an agenda of basically propagating their jobs, creating more and more government jobs essentially, we have a government that has decided that the agenda should be, let's spend the money on providing all these services without actually housing people. Well, if you're not housing people, you're just making the problem bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Like these sorts of basic questions of how do we prioritize the spending of the money should not be left to our representatives. That is something that needs to be driven by the community rather than the staff.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
What is the Brown Act exactly, and why is it important?
So in California, we have the law called the Brown Act, and the Brown Act is our open meetings law. It basically dictates certain parameters that must be taken about how our government is supposed to work. Namely, so we talked about all these different entities, the school boards, the city councils, all the different, the transit districts. What the Brown Act does is it sets up parameters saying that all of these entities have to hold public meetings. At every public meeting, you have to have time allotted in very specific ways for the people to speak. So it allows for citizen engagement in the process, and it forbids the representatives from discussing or making any kind of decisions in the dark. When they make decisions, when they have a quorum of 3 of them, let's say on a 5-person board, in order to make a decision, you have to have three votes out of 5, let's say. And they cannot just simply decide to hold a phone call at 9 o'clock at night and make a decision over $10 million of spending. That's not allowed by the Brown Act. The Brown Act inherently says if you're going to be making any kind of a decision where you have a quorum of members, so in our board of supervisors, that would be 3 people out of 5, so because you need to have 3 votes in order to pass something, right? So you cannot just have 3 supervisors talking to each other and making decisions in the dark. So it allows for public process. It sets the standard that everything has to be on the agenda. The public has to be given notice of every meeting, and it creates basic parameters for how the government works. So we have a transparent government, so that there is an avenue for people to be engaged with their political process. But none of that really matters if the people don't step up and actually show up and be engaged. The Brown Act essentially is the structure that allows for citizen engagement and oversight of our representatives.
That's great.